This is South Africa, one of the most beautiful, most blessed, most richly endowed countries on the face of the globe. South Africa, with no population explosion, with an abundance of arable, useful land, has every reason to be happy and tranquil. But it isn't.
This country is on a collision course. It is as certain to collide with reality as those aeroplanes which have failed to follow the right radar beam. They're on collision course. Nothing can save this country from a very nasty collision.
The press and public opinion overseas has been poisoned by a biased press in South Africa, by a press that wouldn't admit that the policy of separate development was the safe and correct policy for South Africa.
These are the black sash women of Johannesburg, South Africa. White women protesting the tyranny of a minority of 3 million whites over 12 million non-whites. This demonstration was over the recent Sabotage Act, which some have called the most suppressive piece of legislation ever enacted in a country which calls itself a republic. Wearing black sashes and with bowed heads, they lit this torch in protest against the sabotage bill. As they took their positions day after day, young nationalist hoodlums in support of the government position attacked the black sash women with eggs, tomatoes, stones, and water bombs. The black sash women had demonstrated in silence before against apartheid, against the packing of the courts, but this was their most sustained, most courageous act. As the tension built, students and professors from Witwatersrand University joined the demonstration. Under this law, which makes it a crime against the state for anyone, quote, seeking to further or encourage any political aim, including bringing about social or economic change, unquote, anyone can be arrested, denied a pre-trial examination, tried without a jury, and if adjudged guilty, sentenced to civil death, a forced isolation in one's home, banned from phoning, speaking, or writing to anyone outside the immediate family. In fact, banishment from life. The peaceful parade ended in disorder and violence caused by what the New York Times described as some young toughs bearing a remarkable resemblance to those employed by Mussolini and Hitler in the early days of the fascist and Nazi movements. While our cameras were there, voices were willing to be heard. Some of the people on this program speak up at the risk of their lives.
We bow our heads in shame for our country.
CBS Reports Sabotage in South Africa is brought to you by Bristol Myers, makers of Bufferin, the modern drug for pain with special ingredients for timely headache pain relief. Bufferin.
Pain can be a monotonous, persistent, recurring misery to someone who suffers from arthritis. When it is severe or continuous, a doctor's care is needed. If you know someone with arthritis, chances are you know Bufferin. Why? Bufferin cannot cure arthritis, but doctors realize easing its pain is an important part in the treatment. And Bufferin is the modern drug for pain. Special antacids make it possible to even take Bufferin 4, 5, 6 times a day, day after day, to ease minor arthritic pain without fear of stomach distress. Bufferin special antacids rush the pain reliever into the bloodstream with amazing speed. Bufferin, recommended by many doctors with confidence. You may never suffer from arthritis, but you may want relief from the pain of headache, toothache, or neuralgia. Next time, take Bufferin. Amazingly fast Bufferin.
CBS Reports Sabotage in South Africa. Reported by CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Early in November, as America's eyes were riveted on those missile bases in Cuba and the confrontation of President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, a bitter debate raged at the United Nations. The issue, the projected boycott of the Republic of South Africa.
South Africa's policy, Mr. President.
The delegate from South Africa rose in the hostile chamber and declared that the whites of his country had, over the past 3 centuries, built up the most advanced, industrialized nation on the entire African continent. A few could dispute this fact, but in the vote that followed, few disputed the ringing condemnation of that country's racial policy. In what has been called the strongest indictment of a member nation, a resolution carried by a margin of 67 to 16 urged that South Africa be boycotted and expelled from the United Nations. The United States opposed the resolution, stating that the policy of apartheid was offensive to this nation, but that the boycott was impractical and illegal. Victor Hugo once said, "There is one thing stronger than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come." But this year, with freedom exploding all over Africa and Asia, with new nations and new voters burgeoning everywhere, the trend has been dramatically reversed in the Republic of South Africa. The idea of freedom has not yet come to this last remaining bastion of white supremacy in Africa. This vastly endowed land at the foot of the continent, where the Indian and Atlantic Oceans meet, has determined that white domination shall prevail, no matter what the cost to 12 million non-whites. This separate nation is by far the most Western, most industrialized, most economically stable nation on the African continent. It is the gold, uranium, and diamond capital of the world. It assembles automobiles, railroad locomotives, and from its own steel, it manufactures farm and other equipment that it sells to the world. Its rock lobster industry has put South Africa on menus in many lands. It abounds in wildlife, and its Kruger National Park is a preserve of unspoiled beauty. As South Africa's wild game is contained in a special preserve, so are most of the people. And the word is apartheid, a separateness for 10 million African Bantus or black people, 1.5 million coloreds or mixed bloods, and 1/2 million Asians, mostly Indians, a total of 12 million non-whites, whose compounds, separate and apart from the 3 million whites, range from lush highlands of the Transvaal to the prosperous cities of Johannesburg and Cape Town. Apartheid, or separate development, is a fancy word for segregation. Total enforced segregation, a national policy applied at every level, down to and including the home. The South African government is not defensive about this apartheid. They point to it with pride and suggest other nations with a race problem adopt this method. Dr. Wenzel du Plessis, the Secretary for Information, speaks for the government.
It means this, that people are different to one another. They have been so created. It's an inescapable fact. They have different ways of life, different definitions of happiness, different desires, hopes, fears, ambitions. And this difference is good. It's not bad, as the egalitarians want us to believe, because difference impinges on difference and promotes evolutionary growth. We make the claim that we should be allowed to follow our policy to its logical conclusion, because we think it is not only a sound policy, it is also ethically a justifiable policy, and that this relationship which we are establishing between peoples of different races, different colors, different standards, is one which could also very usefully be followed in other parts of the world.
The process you are watching is interrogation of families as part of the separation process.
It affects our life because we are not Africans. We have never lived as Africans. We are always coloreds.
Not only can a Negro not live in a white area, but an African Negro can't live with a South African Indian, and colored mixed blood cannot live with either a Bantu, Indian, or Chinese. Apartheid is absolute, and its policies are enforced at all levels. To physically contain non-whites in their own areas, thousands of natives have been moved by force to housing which they can rent. This housing is an improvement over the slums which infest the cities. But the new locations are up to 20 miles from the cities, with inadequate yet more costly transportation. The whites believe by segregating natives in these townships, they can be more efficiently controlled and thus lessen the fear of having hundreds of thousands of blacks in their midst. But even these huge complexes of separate housing cannot accommodate all of the non-whites. Some live in squalor alongside rubbish heaps in Johannesburg. Others, evicted from their settlements on farms, wander about seeking an area reserved for their color, on which they can resettle with their meager possessions. These families were on a foot journey, 120 miles to Cape Town, to ask the government for a place to live. Producer David Lowe, who was in South Africa for 7 weeks, says it would be difficult for anyone to be unaware of what is happening.
Signs such as these are constant reminders that the different colors must stay apart. European means white, a non-European is black. Every facet of life, from amenities in the streets to the entrance of the public zoo, is based on color. Here, a white minister leaves his black parishioners to enter separate turnstiles, only to meet again inside the zoo grounds. At a post office in Johannesburg, there are separate entrances for the two colors. Inside are separate writing desks and pay telephones. There is a white bus station and a non-white bus station. There are railway cars for whites and coaches for blacks. A courageous housewife, a college graduate, risked imprisonment to say,
well, the whites are the bosses, and they want to make the Africans understand that at all times, that the Africans don't count for anything. They are just the beast of burden in South Africa, so to speak. I suppose that is really why they still tolerate our being in South Africa. We do all the hard work for them, and they can have a royal time.
The whites, looking at the changing Africa patterns to the north, are afraid that once the blacks are given any kind of freedom, the days of the white man in South Africa are numbered. To make sure this doesn't happen, all movements of the black man are controlled. The government forces him to carry a reference or pass book on his person at all times. Failure to obey the pass laws is punishable by fine or imprisonment. A South African native explains how the law is enforced.
They come out in such a way, a rude way, when they come around and ask you for your reference book. And if you don't produce it as quick as they do ask for it, you'll be thrown into the van in no time. Every day, a lot of people get arrested for past offenses. They do come around sometimes in the middle of the night and they wake you up, and they ask you for your passes. They come into your bedroom, they take your blanket and throw it on the floor and leave you there naked. If you happen to have no pajamas, you'll be naked in front of them, with you and your wife too.
Minister of Justice Foster defends the practice.
Each Bantu has to carry a reference book, just as any European has to carry an identity card. As a matter of fact, I've got mine with me if you want to, if you're interested to see it.
Mr. Minister, why does the European have to carry an identity card?
To facilitate identification. And the same with the Bantu, to facilitate identification and to give him a neat and handy book in which to carry all his papers and his service contracts and his tax receipts, etc., etc. Otherwise, he's prone to lose it.
The Minister of Justice failed to add that the white man need not carry his card, but if the black man does not, he is arrested. In South Africa, a milder form of punishment is caning. Last year, 17,000 prisoners received a total of 81,000 strokes with a heavy cane. Minister of Justice Forster sees nothing wrong in this form of punishment.
I was caned by my father. You probably were caned by your father. And
well, I don't think we were caned as hard, though, as these floggings.
No, but it's the same instrument still. When you talk of flogging, you think of something quite different. Juveniles are caned by a light cane, same as my father used on me and any other father would use on his child. As for the adults, a heavier cane, but still a cane, is used.
These and other policies of the government of South Africa have been severely criticized. Rebecca West said, "I've never seen a country as low as this one. It's like a country that is being governed by mad babies." A young South African housewife risked her freedom to say,
I agree that materially it's very privileged, and climatically and everything else, but I find it absolutely terribly depressing. I really do. I mean, just every day it hits me in sort of phases. Every day walking in the streets, not only about the condition now, which is almost overwhelming, because one feels so powerless, really. But if there was some hope for the future, it wouldn't be quite so bad. I witness the same sort of scenes that everybody does in the streets of prejudice in the shops, the sort of prejudice and the sort of humiliation that goes on. Well, for instance, I get 2 to 3 African people per day coming around asking me for work, especially in the Cape, where Africans are endorsed out the whole time, which is a tremendous hardship, splitting of families and children. One feels one is responsible, but I mean, financial help you can give, which doesn't go anywhere. And I also get terribly scared, as regard my own life and my children's lives and their future. Although I'm not prepared to immigrate, because I'd like to see it through, and I'd like my children to grow up and be part of it, and be part of what does develop here, and me and my children, for what we are worth, to help, to guide it, because I love this country very much, and I wouldn't be happy in it anywhere else.
The National Party is the government. In control since 1948, its internal policies are based on territorial and political race segregation. Its credo could well be, separate and survive. Its first prime minister was Dr. Daniel Francois Malan, who during the war stated he hoped Hitler would win. The second prime minister was Johannes Stregum, also a pro-Nazi and in favor of Boskop, or complete white domination. The present Prime Minister, Dr. Hendrik F. Verwoerd, a Nazi sympathizer, has continued and intensified the policies of his predecessors. In 1961, at a Union exposition in Milner Park, Johannesburg, Dr. Verwoerd answered threats of a foreign boycott.
And no country in the world can achieve greater heights for itself by treading on the corpse of a fellow nation. We shall become nobody's corpse. We shall fight for our existence, and we shall survive.
Later, as he sat in the reviewing box, there were shots. 2 bullets fired by a white man found their mark. The Prime Minister's friends rushed to the aid of the stricken minister and tried to stop the photographers. Verwoerd recovered, fully determined to advance the master plan of apartheid without any regard for the moral protests of the whites who opposed his policies. The first major decision to leave the British Commonwealth was made at the Prime Minister's Conference in London. And on May 31st, 1961, South Africa was proclaimed a republic. Although Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd is considered the strong man in South Africa, he has many able men in his cabinet, faithful followers who devoutly believe they are carrying out the dictates of God. Survival for the white minority, separation for the huge voteless black majority. The rigid determination to implement this policy is expressed by the Minister of Lands, Mr. Paul Sauer.
You know, democracy is a very finely strung instrument. If you play it badly, you make a mess of it. And you can only play it if you know how to play it. And this is the instrument that we've learned how to play, this form of democracy. We can get on with it. We can manage it. We know the implications. We train to it. You can say that South Africa is a democracy, or you can say it is not a democracy in the way you look at it. It's a democracy, complete democracy, as far as those people that have the vote exercise it.
Mr. Minister, it would appear that the government you have here seems to be that of a white aristocracy. Isn't that the cause of most of your problems?
No, I don't think it's the cause of many of your problems, but it lays a tremendous responsibility upon those people who govern the country, because they've got to govern the country not only in the interests of the white people who choose them, but they've got to govern the country also in the interests of the millions of barbarous or semi-barbarous or semi-educated or more educated blacks who have not got the vote. And that imposes a tremendous responsibility on any government in South Africa. And that responsibility must not be underrated, the responsibility which the white man feels of his duty towards these underdeveloped people who are not capable of governing themselves, who would fall to pieces if we were not there to look after their interests.
Looking out for their interests also means giving them employment in the mines. 400,000 men are recruited every year, all non-white.
Every day of the year, except Sundays and holidays, trains come to a halt at this siding in Johannesburg. Every day they unload cheap cargoes of human labor. These men are natives from 55 tribes in South Africa, neighboring territories of Mozambique, Nyasaland, the Rhodesias, Basutoland, and Swaziland. Without these men, the economy of South Africa would collapse. They are hired by a labor association whose recruitment posters offer the excitement of travel, life in the big city, and high pay for working 10,000 feet underground. The mines, which have a turnover of 400,000 men a year, have no trouble getting a man to work for the equivalent of $12 a month with food, lodging, medical attention, and protective clothing thrown in. 7 cents an hour working below ground, 5 cents an hour for labor above ground. But getting a job is not an easy process. If a man's record is clear and he has no history of troublemaking, he is sent to a primary staging area where he undergoes a cursory medical examination. A white official told me this selection area in Johannesburg is usually called the sausage factory, for here the men are stripped, examined, x-rayed, bathed, sprayed, and carefully checked to make certain they would give their employers a fair return for an 8-hour, 56-cent day. The gold mine owners say they can't pay more because since 1934, the price of gold has been pegged $35 a fine ounce. However, in 1960, South African gold mines showed a profit of $300 million. These natives are the backbone of South African wealth. If the labor supply were to suddenly cease, a multi-million-dollar investment, 76% of which is owned by British and American interests, would collapse, and so would the Verwoerd government. The government proudly claims that strikes are rare in South Africa. This is true. The explanation is simple. Non-whites, by law, are denied the right to strike. In another part of the compound, the natives who have completed their contracts are processed out. They wait quietly for their papers, and many sign on for another contract period for a bonus of 2 cents a day. Some of their meager earnings go for possessions to take back to their families, or for a hat, a pair of glasses, or a guitar. I saw one man's paycheck for 9 months' work. It was for $57.
All labor in the mines and out is controlled by the powerful Bureau of Mines. Secretary for Information du Plessis was asked if the government was using the full potential of African labor.
Yes. You must understand that the black man in his traditional environment 50, 60 years ago was not a worker. He was a soldier, a warrior. We had to teach him that, in the first place, that work was something which a man could do and still be a bride unto his women. Then we had to teach him to work satisfactorily, and we have reached the stage now where he likes work.
CBS reports sabotage in South Africa continues immediately after this message. CBS reports sabotage in South Africa continues. Here again is Walter Cronkite.
This year, Prime Minister Verwoerd introduced the Transkei Plan to establish the first of several Bantustans or separate reserves for the 10 million natives. The government intends to geographically separate the blacks from the whites, except those natives needed as domestics, porters, street cleaners, and mine workers. It could be compared to forcibly moving all of the Negroes in the United States into one of the southern states and restricting them to their boundaries except when needed for menial employment reserved by law exclusively for Negroes. The Transkei starts at the Great Kai River and ends at the borders of the Natal province. Scenically, it is beautiful, but economically, it is depressing. The capital of the Transkei, Umtata, is some 500 miles from Johannesburg and Kimberley. The Transkei is far enough away from these cities to maintain racial separation, but near enough to serve as a labor supply depot for their gold and diamond mines. In its 16,000 square miles are 2 million natives, primitive, uneducated members of a tribal society. Chief Kaiser Montanzima, carefully chosen by the Fairfort government to become first native leader of the Transkei, told David Lowe this plan was a step forward for his people.
I feel this way because it is the policy of the South African government that the white races and the black races should live separately. And to that end, they are 100% unanimous.
Then you think that there is no hope for a multiracial society here in South Africa?
There is no hope for a multiracial society in South Africa at all. If we cannot get equal representation with the white people in their House of Assembly, it is very well that we may just be left alone.
The political leader of the Transkei, a close friend of Prime Minister Verwoerd, Commissioner General Abram, was interviewed by David Lowe.
Would you classify a native as a subversive who doesn't like the nationalist government and says so?
No, they say so every day. I can quote from numerous Bantu publications, very vile criticism leveled at the national government, and yet they go free. But once they become a danger to the security of the state, we cannot allow them to run free. And you won't do the same in the States either. But we do not do very much with them. We deport, as we call it, some of them from their environs. We settle them in another part of the country where they cannot do much damage to the fabric of their tribe and their nation.
Secretary for Information du Plessis was asked if the black people could be happy segregated in this fashion.
I think they are happy about it. They should be. If they're not happy about that, then they must be happy about the opposite. And the opposite would be an integrated nation, which is completely out of the question, as they should well know. It would never be accepted by the white people, with very good reason. And from that, there could only ensue chaos, not only for us, but also for them.
One of the government's harshest critics is Patrick Duncan, son of the former Governor General of the Union of South Africa. Duncan, publisher of the liberal newspaper Contact, whose office has been searched many times by secret police, is on the banned list. By consenting to be interviewed by David Lowe, Patrick Duncan defied government orders not to speak, risking imprisonment.
What sort of a government do you think you have here?
At the moment, Mr. Lowe, it's a government which is nearly as harsh as the government of Mussolini in the middle 30s. That is to say, if you are black, you may be deported, you may be exiled for many years. Many people have died in exile in the last few years, with no trial, no charge. They are just removed by this government, and they have to spend months and years in exile.
How do you exist under such circumstances?
Well, if I were a life insurance agent, I don't know that I'd take my own life on. I think things are going to be very tough here. I think violence has already happened. Violence was in Ponderland last year, Sharpeville 1960. Violence is coming in the near future, probably in the Transkei.
Mr. Duncan, on the basis of your experience in South Africa, what is the life of the black man like?
I'm afraid I can't tell you. As a white South African, I have no personal experience of it. I think the state in this country is breaking the primeval law of partnership. Since the beginning of time, two human beings have gone into partnership, they've pooled the effort, and they have shared the fruit. Here in South Africa, the effort is pooled, but the fruits are not shared. You see, on Sundays they go into church, and they read the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule doesn't say, do unto other whites. It says, do unto others. They know perfectly well they're not doing right. They have bad consciences.
Do you think the white man is motivated by fear?
Yes, I mean, I think the white man is like the ordinary human in any circumstance. There's a quotation, I don't know where it comes from, that which I have greatly feared is come to pass. If you, as an ordinary human in America or Britain, if you fear something obsessively, you unconsciously almost bring it about. If you fear death quite obsessively, you'll end up by dying.
Do you think that is happening?
Certainly. The whites are, in many ways, acting to their own disadvantage. They are, in many ways, pulling down their own house. Quite unconsciously. I mean, for Woodt, with all his policies, in many ways, I liken him to the demolition hammer in the hand of God. He does many things which he doesn't understand, are in fact pulling down this evil house. He doesn't understand it, but he's doing it.
Shortly after this interview, Patrick Duncan was banned again for an additional 5 years and restricted to the Cape Town area and again denied freedom of speech. A few days later, Duncan narrowly escaped arrest by fleeing to Basutoland, a British protectorate where he now lives in exile. One of the bravest critics is Mrs. Helen Suzman, the only member of Parliament for the Progressive Party. Her fight against apartheid has been a continuing act of courage. Mrs. Suzman comments on the behavior of Verwoerd and his followers.
It's a peculiar sort of death wish, I would say. An extraordinary inability to make concessions, which to me anyway don't appear to be tremendous concessions, but which the nationalists, for instance, simply cannot adjust themselves to making. They talk in these melodramatic terms. They say, if we die, it will be our fate and not our fault. And white unity is necessary to preserve Western civilization and so on, without realizing that by making a few simple concessions, the whole atmosphere in this country could change almost overnight. The whole propaganda machine has been geared to this whole idea of white supremacy, or else the end of the white race must come. The question of living in a multiracial country with harmonious relations doesn't occur to them as a feasible alternative. And one knows that the press is watched, speeches are watched, people have been banned, people have been banished without trial. This applies to Africans only, incidentally, the banishment without trial. People's movements have been circumscribed, and there is no recourse to the courts. And as long as that atmosphere pervades, where what I call the fundamental liberty of being able to appeal against authoritarian action, as long as that position prevails, where one is denied that freedom, there is a sense of fear in this country.
If some whites are brave enough to help the black people, few natives can communicate with the whites. This courageous woman was asked if she could discuss racial problems with Europeans or whites.
Well, if they start talking, we talk. But these days we are afraid of talking about the racial question to anybody at all. It's become very dangerous in South Africa to discuss the racial problem at all.
What would happen if you did discuss the racial problem?
I'd be regarded as a communist.
Apartheid has made its impact on religion in South Africa, splitting the Dutch Reformed and Anglican churches. Prime Minister Verwoerd said, God has given a divine task and calling to our country. And his church, the Dutch Reformed Church, rigidly practices white domination. But the Anglican Church severely condemns the racial policies of the nationalist government. The Archbishop of Cape Town, leader of the Anglican Church in South Africa, the Most Reverend Juste de Blanc, comments on apartheid.
In the first place, I think it denies the essential solidarity of the human race. It's fundamental to our religious belief that man is made in God's image, whatever the color of his skin. And therefore, the moment you begin to insist that for no other reason than a difference in pigmentation, one man is superior to another, you're denying the fundamental basis of a religious belief in creation.
How can the non-white hold on to his belief in God if the white man who introduced him to this God does not practice the basic principles of that religion?
The newer generation that arises puts this exactly as you have. They say, now why should we accept your God when obviously Christianity is the white man's religion and it is mobilized in the service of the white man, and it is to our disadvantage.
Most members of the Nationalist Party belong to the Dutch Reformed Church, which officially endorses the separation policies of the government. One of their spokesmen, the minister of the Stellenbosch Reformed Church, Reverend Van Wyk.
I think that a man who supports the policy of apartheid or separate development can, in his treatment of the non-white, lead that man to Christ as effectually as people who do not support it. Because the policy of apartheid, I think, the separate development policy, has as its basic tenet that you are trying to do unto others as they would do unto you, as you would have them do unto you. That is, you want to give them the same privileges and the same responsibilities eventually as you have yourself. And once people realize that, then I am convinced there can be no difficulty in the acceptance of Christian religion or holding on to the faith in God. Let me add immediately that there are, of course, as an interim arrangement, certain laws, certain practices which do cause hardship, both for whites and non-whites, and it probably will be so for quite some time still.
What does it do to you when you see some of the differences the other colors have to live under and some of the things they don't have?
To be perfectly frank, and speaking now as a man and a Christian, it hurts me terribly. There is no doubt whatsoever that there are many things in this country which must hurt every Christian who is true to the conviction which he has that Jesus Christ came to save all men, that all men are of equal worth before God. And it does hurt me terribly.
CBS Reports continues immediately after this message. CBS Reports sabotage in South Africa continues. Here again is Walter Cronkite.
Is the voice of protest heard in South Africa? Most of the opposition has been stilled by banning or arrest, and no longer can their words be heard or read. Any action by whites favoring justice for non-whites is a dangerous enterprise in South Africa. Verwoerd and his colleagues find it difficult to distinguish between a traitor and a critic. Speaking out against the suppressive policies of the Nationalist Party invites being called an enemy of the state. Criticism becomes sabotage, and protest is called treason. One of the first to feel the government's wrath was Father Trevor Huddleston, who for 12 years fought apartheid. When he left South Africa, he quoted from an Alan Paton book in which a young African native says, "I have one great fear in my heart, that when they are turned to loving, we shall be turned to hating." Actually, violence already has come to South Africa. In 1960, the continuing injustice of the racial laws broke an uneasy peace, and the natives emerged as a force to be reckoned with. The major cities of South Africa were hit by protests, riots, violence, and killings. In Durban, thousands of natives marched from Cato Manor to demand the release of Chief Albert Luthuli and other imprisoned African leaders. The police fired, and Africans fell and died. In Cape Town, 30,000 Africans from the nearby native township of Langa marched to the buildings of Parliament, and thousands of whites locked their doors and waited for the black wave to take their revenge for the injustices of the past. But it was Sharpeville which shocked the world. It happened on Monday, March 21st, 1960. Several hundred natives gathered peaceably to protest the pass laws. Police, mounted on tanks, opened fire. 69 natives were killed, 176 wounded. Most of the victims were shot in the back. Some of the dead were children, women, and elderly men. The Bishop of Johannesburg, Ambrose Reeves, called Sharpeville the tragic consequence of the desperate endeavor to preserve what is called white supremacy. A Apartheid, he said, is a way of death, not of life. But the shocking lesson of the Sharpeville massacre has been ignored by the Verwoerd government. The question in South Africa is how long can so many people endure suppression, restriction, and segregation without fighting back? But the fight for freedom requires leaders, a rare commodity in a country where education for the white child costs $180 per year, for the black child, $25, where only 2,000 out of 10 million natives have college degrees. The foremost leader of the South African black people is Chief Albert Luthuli, but today his voice cannot be heard. Nothing he writes or says can be printed or repeated. Even this painting of Luthuli as Christ, Verwoerd and Minister of Justice Forster as Roman soldiers, has been banned. Luthuli's crime is seeking political and economic freedom for his people. In 1961, in recognition of his devotion to his cause, Chief Albert Luthuli was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. At the presentation ceremonies in the Oslo University Festival Hall, the citation read, "Should the non-white population of South Africa ever rise from their position of humiliation without having recourse to violence and terror, then this will be due above all to Luthuli, their fearless and incorruptible leader." Should, however, the day dawn when the struggle of the non-whites in South Africa to win their freedom degenerates into bloody slaughter, then Luthuli's voice will be heard no more. Chief Luthuli was interviewed by David Lowe in Oslo, Norway.
I must say that we look to countries like the United States, Great Britain, and other countries to exert pressure on South Africa. I must emphasize that. I think at United Nations and at other levels too, you should use your influence to show the government of South Africa and the white people of South Africa that they're completely out of step. So much so that if they continue, you may have to say, well, friends, you are our friends, but we may not have dealings with you, you know. And one must say we appreciate what is being done at United Nations and so on. But there must come a stage when just mere talk ceases and action starts.
Chief Luthuli, more laws are passed against the blacks and more regulations and more restrictions. Do you still believe in the goodness of man?
I do. One must believe in the goodness of man. For if you cease to trust man, how can you operate in the world? I humbly say, I attribute all actions of men to the weaknesses which we possess, human frailty. I mean, even the white man's oppression arises out of selfishness, pride, and greed. Well, those are universal weaknesses. They may be intensified under certain situations amongst some people. And I repeat, once you cease to have belief in man, then you cease to have belief in God, you know. You cease to believe in the redemption of man.
Chief Luthuli, do you still believe in your policy of nonviolence?
I do. And again here, I must say, it isn't just Albert Luthuli. It's this organization. It's a method that the organization agreed upon. And I must emphasize that in the situation that obtains in South Africa, I can't see any other method being valid. Even from a practical angle, leaving out the question of the philosophy of nonviolence, I don't think that some of us are Gandhites or pacifists, but we are realists in the situation in South Africa. And what else could you have? I suppose the question generally suggests that you might resort to violence. What do you get out of violence? Except that you increase the chances of bitterness. And are you more likely, in fact, with violence to reach your ends? I say no. I say no. Definitely say no.
Even among his own people, Chief Luthuli has been criticized for not advocating more direct action against apartheid. One of the young African leaders who disagrees is Oliver Tambo, deputy president of the outlawed African National Congress, who now is in exile in London.
What we want in South Africa is that our humanity should be acknowledged, that those who are ruling in that country should pay some respect to the concept of human dignity. You have 12 million people in South Africa who are treated as if they were subhumans. We don't want this status. We are rejecting it entirely. And we want to be liberated, or to liberate ourselves. If nobody will do that, we will liberate ourselves so that in South Africa, I should feel that I'm a human being in that country. And I don't feel so now at all. I feel I'm a stranger, a foreigner, and at best, an animal in South Africa. This is how I feel.
Minister of Justice Balthazar J. Forster again.
I can naturally understand that you are concerned about civil liberties, having fought for your freedom, same as we fought for ours. And therefore we are just as concerned about civil liberties as people in the United States, or for that matter, people in democracies all over the world. But of course, one must always bear in mind that liberty must not be licensed. And it is no use the individual having certain liberties if the nation as a whole goes under and is subverted and undermined. So the problem is to keep the balance, as it were, between rights on the one hand and obligations to the state, to the country, and to the people as a whole on the other side.
We almost called this program The Brave Women of South Africa. Among the bravest are the women of the Black Sash, who stand publicly in silence to protest the government's laws of suppression. When the sabotage bill was first introduced, citizens who feared it meant the end of all civil liberties in South Africa staged protests. Students used effigies to show what the bill would outlaw. You can't criticize the Minister of Justice. You can't paint slogans or pass out leaflets. These and other actions against the government would become crimes. Members of the Anglican Church joined the protest, and the brave women of the Black Sash stood their ground, keeping their vigil in impressive silence around the torch of freedom. When hoodlums of the Nationalist Party, crashing police barriers, rushed in, violence broke out. These young toughs, bent on disrupting a peaceful meeting, roughed up photographers and then went to work in earnest on students and professors who gathered to protest the infamous piece of legislation. Is this country, as Patrick Duncan said, already on a collision course? Is South Africa, which calls itself a republic, extinguishing the torch of freedom? Some say that South Africa's Sabotage Act, with its recent enforcement of house arrests, has snuffed out freedom. Mrs. Helen Joseph, a British subject who lives in Johannesburg, is by the government's definition the most notorious saboteur in South Africa. She describes the provision for house arrest in her garden, where she's completing a book titled, If This Be Treason.
Here in South Africa, the Minister of Justice has thought up some new form of intimidation and persecution for those of us who believe in the fundamental rights of human people, for those of us who believe that we must oppose apartheid and all its evil manifestations. And this is what he's thought up: house arrest. And I want to tell you just what house arrest means. It means this, that you can be forced to stay in your house day after day, night after night, and only allowed out for the minimum time for you to go to work and earn your living. You can be forced to stay in your house all over the weekend. The minister will decide who shall come and see you. All your friends can be cut off from you. The minister can decide for you how often you must report to the police. He can make it every day. We don't know who'll be the first for this house arrest. Perhaps it can be me. I don't know. But this I want to say, that if I am to be the first in line for this peculiarly refined form of torture which the minister intends to inflict upon us, and he makes no bones about it, then I want to say that no amount of intimidation, no amount of persecution which this government can heap upon me, and I've had plenty in the past, will ever turn me from the path which I have chosen. And that is the path that I tread with all the people of this country towards the freedom that we know that we shall get in the end.
A few days after she had made that statement, Mrs. Joseph became the first to be placed under house arrest. She must report to the police each day. Her movements and friendships are restricted. In effect, she has suffered civil death. Mrs. Joseph was the first. Since then, other South Africans have been placed under house arrest. We could not close this report without reiterating the position of the South African government as stated by Minister of Land Sauer.
And now if we can get people to see conditions in South Africa themselves and not go on hearsay and not go on the wild and libelous statements that are made by people that you can call nothing less than agitators at the United Nations. Not go on those things, but come and have a look themselves. We enjoy having them. We've got nothing to hide. Nothing to hide at all. We don't ask you to come and agree with us in everything. But what we do ask you is to understand our problems before you criticize us. And we feel that a lot of the criticism against South Africa is made by people who don't understand the position here at all. They've just got no idea what it's all about.
For 7 weeks, our cameras were in South Africa, and the opinions of those who support the policies of apartheid and the Sabotage Act have been on view. Whether the experiment now going on there is an example for the rest of the world, as South African officials say, or whether it is an act of shame, as the ladies of the Black Sash say, is something that the world and the UN can judge, but only the people of South Africa can do much about. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
South Africa. Is there a case for South Africa? Many Americans say there is no case. It is a state based on racism, and the Reagan administration is a partner in that crime. The South African government argues that Western news reports are one-sided and one-dimensional, that their society is more complex than simply black and white, that there's another side to their story. They say democracy American style does not work in Africa. In this, the facts sadly support them. Virtually every state in independent black Africa is a one-party state. Only the degree of oppression and corruption varies. South Africa also points to the mismanagement of agriculture that's responsible in part for the massive famine now taking place in countries to the north. The president, P.W. Botha, pleads that South Africa is a country in transition, entitled to the same consideration and patience as any country with a colonial past. We went to South Africa to hear him out and to see just how justified he is in saying the country is changing. Tonight, the other side of the story. Our vision of South Africa is of uncompromising apartheid, uncompromising racism. We mostly have news clip knowledge of the country, but while this is happening, so is this, and this. To our eyes, these are merely routine scenes of urban life. In South Africa, this breaking down of legislated racial barriers is a cosmic political event. These are changes that only a few years ago seemed beyond all possibility. One white South African, a severe critic who lived in exile for 20 years, returned as a tourist and was astounded to find the theaters virtually fully integrated, both in the audience and on the stage.
It's not the end of the world, you know. Yet. August!
The restaurants, not just the fancy international hotel restaurants, but fast food joints, no longer segregated. The most earthy kinds of establishments where apartheid was practiced most harshly are open to anyone with the price of a game. And in places where contact is even closer, the old rules no longer apply. The steady collapse of at least the outward signs of apartheid continues slowly. The author of these changes is a most unlikely one, a man whose life and ideology have been the embodiment of apartheid. Pieter William Botha, Prime Minister just recently made President of the Republic. Botha, the Afrikaner whose forefathers settled here in Cape Town on the southern tip of Africa more than 3 centuries ago, had been a key figure in keeping the faith of apartheid, in keeping this breathtaking city and this bountiful country firmly in the hands of a white minority. His instruments were his national party and, here in Cape Town, the Parliament. And yet, here is P.W. Botha welcoming new members to his President's Council.
Wonderful to be here.
It was Botha who wrought the constitutional changes that brought non-whites into the government for the first time, giving people of mixed blood, so-called coloreds, and Asians political representation in a 3-chamber parliamentary system.
I almost broke down yesterday when we started the session, that we waited so long for such a consensus to take place, and it took place.
Blacks remain excluded, but colored and Asian parties say they will use their new political rights, however slight, to end that exclusion. Critics call the new constitution a hoax, a way of perpetuating apartheid and keeping real power even more firmly in white hands. Botha's own right wing calls it a sellout, an opening of the floodgates of change that will drown their white promised land in a sea of black power. To them, Botha is a dangerous reformer. If he is one, he is an unlikely one. At 68, he has spent his entire working life as a bureaucrat for the National Party, the party of the white tribe of South Africa, whose roots go back to 17th century Holland. Botha is a stern, old-fashioned man, very religious, very private, the quintessential Afrikaner. He was considered by friend and foe in and out of his party to lack the imagination to lead, strictly the good soldier Botha. Today, his enemies on the left see him as an old racist in new clothing. On the right, as a traitor to the true faith of apartheid. Botha and his supporters see themselves as a new political center. Above all, pragmatists who are prepared to accept gradual change, never revolutionary change. Botha, chief of state of a pariah, an outcast nation, is determined to adjust.
But let me tell them,
we must adapt or die, he says. The we he speaks of are these men at the annual Congress of the National Party. For 40 years, they have dominated South African politics, as stiff-necked a group of backwoodsmen as you will find anywhere, yet Botha brought them around. You are said to be a blind party man, one of the architects of apartheid. And now you seem determined in many ways to dismantle apartheid, or the overt signs of apartheid. What caused this change in you?
in the first instance, let us just understand each other on what is meant by apartheid. If apartheid, which is an Afrikaans word for separateness, and there's no hate element in it, if that means, in the words of the international community, that it is a way of life to deny others their normal human rights, then I reject it. And I've always rejected it.
He does not, of course, absolutely reject it. Certainly not in terms of political rights or in rescinding the laws that dictate where a person may live. Thus, sprawling black townships, which include black millionaires and black professionals, but are mostly made up of black working class and black poverty class. Outside of the townships, apartheid is disappearing. Petty rules have been repealed or are ignored. Sports have become integrated. Some of higher education is integrated. Even the laws that ban marriage and sexual relations between the races are expected to be lifted next year. Race or ethnicity in South Africa is the inescapable topic A. Being Afrikaner or English, Italian or Portuguese, Jewish or Indian or Zulu or Tswana or Xhosa or Soto is stated almost immediately to a visitor. The broad breakdown is almost 5 million whites, 23 million blacks, over 2.5 million coloreds, and 750,000 Asians. The blacks may massively outnumber all others, but they are hardly a cohesive bloc, split by tribe, tradition, and religion. At least 1 million are not South African at all, but illegal immigrants from independent African states who come seeking better wages and living conditions. No matter what South Africa's reputation may be, it offers the highest level of black literacy on the continent, the highest state benefits, and roughly the same political freedom as its neighbors. Blacks provide the labor that keeps the farms and mines and kitchens and factories of South Africa producing. They're without political rights, but in recent years they have gained power through the union movement. Organized labor is as rare on this continent as freedom of speech. Many South African factories are foreign-owned. American companies have led the way in changing the structure of apartheid on the job. They have maintained a policy of equal pay for equal work, a single union contract that has forced black man and white man to work together, and lately opened up supervisory jobs to blacks. Today, apartheid has been virtually banished from the assembly line. But when union leaders tried to raise their voices against apartheid beyond the factory floor, they were immediately arrested. Nevertheless, the union movement has meant opportunity and economic clout for blacks.
He's actually incurred these expenses. We have to process them into the system.
If South Africa does have an ideology, it is one that it shares with much of the world: consumerism. Black and white together make their daily religious trek. It is called shopping. Since money has only one color, it makes for the easy mixing of all colors. Regular paychecks, it can be argued, are a remarkable integrating force. It is also argued that the larger the black middle class becomes, the more intense the pressure will be on the white power structure to grant political reform. For what is ultimately at stake is this: they have built themselves a nation of cities that will rival anything anywhere. In the process, they have also built something that is very difficult to simply walk away from. Scratch most liberal whites here deeply enough, and you will find people not prepared to submit to immediate black autonomy. There has not yet been a single successful black-dominated multiracial democracy in Africa. Not a popular view, but a bitter fact. As out of sympathy as one might be with white South African attitudes, one can hardly blame them for holding on to this glorious land. Almost all agree that change must happen, that the old utter intransigence will no longer work. But change happens very slowly, at an ox's pace. Botha will prod the ox, but only so hard. There are limits to restructuring society, limits that must be publicly stated.
A system of one man, one vote in a unitary state in the Republic of South Africa will simply not work. It will simply not work.
I'm not prepared to overthrow orderly government. That is a minimum requirement for me. Orderly government.
Reverse it. What are the things you are prepared to accept?
What I'm prepared to accept is to grant full political rights to every minority, every people with its own historical background, its own ambitions, under a system of devolution of power, so that they will be able to control their own affairs.
And by that, Botha means the homelands, areas set aside along tribal lines, small black independent nations under the umbrella of the South African economic and security systems. There are 4 of these homelands so far, and the rest of the world ignores them as independent states. They are seen by blacks and much of the world to be like the new Constitution, another hoax, a means of perpetuating white power in the richest part of the country, reducing South Africa's black population by assigning it to the bleakest, least arable parts, while maintaining an easily available black workforce. Nevertheless, South Africa pours hundreds of millions, almost 10% of its national budget, into these homelands.
I am prepared to cooperate in the economic field, provided it is a system of private initiative. I am prepared to overthrow measures of the past which are not necessary for the protection of my right to self-determination.
Can you envisage a day in which there will be full equality for blacks in this country?
Not in the sense that it is being applied in many African states.
Oh, that's an enigmatic answer.
But in the sense, yes, that it will satisfy my conscience, I say yes.
En wat sê daar die internasionale monetaire fonds? Hy sê Afrika-state, talle van hulle staan voor die dood.
The hardliner emerges whenever he feels he must reassure the faithful, calm the doubtful, and impress outsiders that South Africa is not about to collapse in the face of other people's moral outrage. To back him, there is the most powerful armed force on the continent, and the suspicion that it is a nuclear force. Incidentally, the South African army is now fully integrated. Blacks and whites share barracks and dining halls. It was Botha, as defense minister, who did this. He has used his army to great effect in neighboring Angola and Mozambique, and then signed treaties of peace and cooperation with both those states. Important proof, Botha feels, that South Africa is prepared to fight or negotiate with black nationalists. They must decide that in the final analysis, South Africa is a major strategic presence in the world. The word pariah is only slightly annoying rhetoric.
I can't care less, because what we must do in South Africa is do what is right, not what the world tells us to do. And I think it's right to allow people to execute its own, exercise its own right of self-determination.
Do you feel that, apart from public statements made by this politician or that politician, that the United States is really a good friend of South Africa?
I'm not a cynic, but I don't believe that you have love and friendship between nations. I think you have interests between nations. And I think the United States and the Republic of South Africa have common interests. But the moment the interests between states diminish, that moment they drive apart.
What would an economic boycott do to this country? Could you survive it?
They couldn't even apply a proper arms boycott against us. We defeated it. We are exporting now.
Do I detect a new assertiveness about South Africa in the sense that, look, here we are, we're very strong, we're changing, and we are going to be ourselves whether anyone else likes it or not?
Well, you see, we don't want to tell the world, go to the devil. I don't think that is the way we should deal with the international world. All we need is mutual respect. There is no other country with the complex problems that we have here. We are a United Nations in the small, and we are going about it in our own way, and we are not arrogant, but we are determined.
The world has been saying for 40 years that the apocalypse is coming. If a time bomb is ticking away here, away from the black townships anyway, few seem to notice it. The attitude on race is changing, particularly among the young. A park that only a few years ago was whites only becomes a park for anyone who wants to use it. And all do, and the world does not end. In political terms, the millions of blacks are very weak. They are divided. waiting for outside events, boycotts, and condemnation to liberate them. More active means are harshly suppressed. At the same time, there are new possibilities for them. However unacceptable the West may find South Africa's system, it lives with it because South Africa is the major source of strategic minerals. But on those questions of human rights, Botha and his supporters say the world will not acknowledge that on their continent, their courts are fairer, their press freer, their concern for the poor and hungry far greater. And finally, they say, do not compare us with the world's model democracies. Compare us with the democracies of Africa, most of the Arab world, much of Asia, and all of the Soviet Empire.